Welcome back to another episode of Radical Narrative. I am your host, Mylan Satusis. Today I'm giving you an episode I did with Decolonized Buffalo and a panel of very special guests where we discussed settler colonialism in regards to what settler allies have to realize, especially in context to Marxism and leftist theory, in terms of how some lefties tend to come to indigenous nationhood and decolonization conversations, and again, calling into question settler colonialism and how it's very paramount in terms of our analysis to be critical of settler colonialism and the settler colonial state. Without further ado, here's my panel with Decolonized Buffalo. I'll hand it over and you can listen in to all those introductions that took place a few weeks ago now. So it's coming to you a bit late, but here it is. Hope you enjoy it. Be sure to stay tuned and listen in. Talk to you soon.
Welcome to Decolonized Buffalo podcast. My name is Derek. I'm hosting tonight, and we have Mylan from Radical Narrative. We have Yamo. We have Victor also. Yeah, I think it's just us four. If you guys wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, maybe in that order: Mylan, Yamo, Victor.
Yeah, cool. My name is Mylan Satusis. I'm from Treaty 6 territory up here in Canada, north of the border. Host of Radical Narrative, technically formally a PhD candidate, but I do position myself in my community and my territory as Plains Cree Nakota. That's where I was born and raised, and definitely anti-colonial, anti-capitalist. I believe in our original nations as Indigenous people. So a lot of my perspective comes from, obviously, hearing, the stories of resistance and hearing the stories of nationhood that settler colonialism has attempted to oppress over the last few hundred years. And again, just living in a modern world, trying to navigate the colonial chaos critically. So that's who I am, where I come from.
Yes, let's see. I'm Yamo. I'm over here in Maidu territory in Chico, California, occupied Chico, California. I'm from Pomo Nation. My family, I got the Chamorro family from Guam. I consider myself a Marxist-Leninist. Happy to be here with you. Getting over a bout of COVID-19 right now, so bear with me.
All right, Victor, you want to give an intro?
I didn't know if Yahweh was done because he didn't mute. And Yahweh Scano. My name is Victor Jacket. I'm not any of these amazing things. I'm just a machinist with a lot of political opinions. I do also consider myself a Marxist-Leninist with focus on anti-colonialism and the Juche idea. And yeah, that's about it.
All right. Yeah. I love this panel. All big fans of all you guys. And to start off, like in my show notes here, I wasn't sure where to start because this all intersects so much at different points, but I think it's worth. I think it's to hit on this theme. I think there's a lot of what sticks out to me in these whole conversations. We're going to talk about under settler colonialism, what the role of settlers, colonizers could be that is positive, and what roles are negative that they play. Obviously, we're looking to build a future that includes everyone, including colonizers, settlers. Like, at the end of the day, I think we all just want sovereignty. We all for our peoples equally. Everyone across the globe deserves sovereignty. And self-determination, and us in particular, we're advocating for socialist liberation. But yeah, so what roles colonizers, settlers can play. What I see a lot of is this debate about what the primary contradiction is. Us as Marxists, we do a lot of theorizing about what the contradictions, which vary from place to place across the globe. Obviously, like we deal with different contradictions here in the settler colonial United States than they did in the USSR, in China. You know, these are very different people that we're organizing. So as much as there is to learn from those socialist projects, we have the onus is on us to create a whole new theory for this continent, for this hemisphere, even you could say generally. I think it's all this hemisphere's history and future is very interconnected. But yeah, so we talk a lot about what the primary contradiction is. And what I notice a lot of is a lot of people, I'd say primarily, you know, are white comrades, but you know, I'd say I've seen from many different groups this focus on anti-imperialism. And while I can guarantee everyone on this recording would consider themselves an anti-imperialist, I think we would all also agree that imperialism wouldn't exist without European colonialism, which has more or less acted as has been the global hegemony for the last 500 plus years. That, you know, Europe and its settler colonies has determined what happens in the world largely over the past 500 plus years, in spite of uprisings and resistance to colonialism. Yeah, so like we see, I think everyone here sees the primary contradiction as more than just imperialism, but more broadly European colonialism, because that is the basis on which imperialism exists. Like there would not be imperialism were there not if there wasn't the United States. And yeah, I'll leave it there for the setup, and I'll hand it over to Victor, who has I'd love to hear.
I'd have to say that, I mean, obviously, you know me from outside of here, but that's something that I agree with. I think that a lot of people don't want to come to the conclusion that colonialism is the primary contradiction for the struggle on this continent. I don't necessarily think that imperialism is only born out of colonialism. Imperialism is generally born out of the need for capital to expand into untapped markets. Otherwise, it dies. It stops growing. And as you know, under capitalism, the purpose of capital is to grow exponentially and infinitely, and damn the actual capabilities of reality to sustain that. But again, back to colonialism being in my opinion, and I'm sure other people's opinion, yours specifically, Derek, your idea that I agree with, colonialism being the primary contradiction here, and specifically Anglo-American imperialism being born from that, I would say is an accurate assumption. If the colonization of the American continents never happened, there would be no American imperialism. There would probably still be British imperialism, and there would maybe obviously be Japanese imperialism at some point in history. Obviously, you know, German imperialism around the time of the Second World War, assuming that without the colonization of the United States, which inspired Germany, or specifically Nazi Germany, would World War II have even happened? It's you know, it's unknowable, but I'm sure you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah, does anyone else have thoughts on that? on the primary contradiction?
I'll add in there. I think this episode, the reason we're having this episode right now is because we're having conflict with settler, our settler comrades about what is the primary contradiction here. Particularly with the emergence of the so-called patriotic socialists and so forth, who certainly aren't portraying the primary contradiction as colonialism. So, I mean, I think that's kind of why we're all here today talking about that is you have this illusion that's in the minds of settlers that see themselves as leftists, maybe simply because they're not Republicans or whatever. And that illusion is that they're leftists or, even socialists or communists, without acknowledging this primary and initial contradiction. This, and we're talking about the genocide of 100 million indigenous people on this continent. These people, these Europeans who are portraying themselves, posing as this fictitious identity, whether it be Americans or Canadians or so forth. They're trying to skip over our reality, ignore our reality, and erase our reality, and make it to get to the class contradictions, right? But the class contradictions couldn't exist without the initial colonialism contradiction on this continent, right? Because we have a situation where we're trying to organize those of us indigenous folks that are have the understanding of communism, which essentially came from our people to begin with, as Marx clearly stated. The whole concept, behind communism is his study,
collectivism, right?
Right, his studying of us. So we wouldn't be having this conversation had that initial contradiction not occurred on this continent. And that contradiction being our genocide, right? Not just us, but also the enslavement of 100 million Africans, like the largest human trafficking event in human history of, 100 million African people being forced, human trafficked across an entire ocean to build these colonies, right? For free, right? At the end of a whip, right? And that's exactly why it's the main contradiction that has to be addressed on this continent, because they've been teaching all of our children through forced boarding schools, through the lies, the so-called education that they give us in school, that we're Americans and that this continent's called America. But the reality is, Amerigo Vespucci had absolutely no right to have the entire Western Hemisphere named after him. Right. So there lies the initial contradiction. You can't step over it. Because if you step over it, you're just trying to step over us. You're trying to step over our entire continent, the entire Western Hemisphere, all of the blood, all of the world's worst genocide is here. You know what I'm saying? And this is what they're trying to step over because it's uncomfortable, because they have guilt and responsibility to take for it. You know what I'm saying? So that's the conversation, I believe. I just wanted to contribute, kind of tee that up for everybody, because that's kind of what we're here to discuss, I believe.
Thank you. Yeah, that was excellent. That was made a bunch of great points. Thank you. Yeah, Rick. Yeah. Mylan.
Okay. Yeah, we both put our hands up at the same time. Yeah, I think I feel from my perspective, obviously what we're talking about too is the general reality that settlers glitch out when it comes to looking at indigenous issues and perspectives. because the reality is settler colonialism is ongoing, and that, basically when you look around, you're seeing the infrastructure, you're seeing the benefits, you're seeing the lived reality of a history of colonialism play out that benefits a group of people that is not my people. Right? And that's the very real reality that, me growing up on the prairie here in Saskatchewan, I witnessed that. Like, there's a very real reason why there's not indigenous farmers out here, and that majority of them are white settlers farming the land and territory. And then when it comes to, like, when settlers hear this, and, being an educator, having a lot of, settler students come into my class and out the other end, there tends to be, I feel like, a shift in the consciousness to want to look critically at their family systems, want to look critically at their history. But then at the same time, it's almost like a surface level introspection. Like, it's not necessarily diving into the emotional discomforts of the role their families played or the benefits that they reaped. And if it does, I mean, that's great. Like, I'm not generalizing everybody. I know there's some really cool settler allies and friends that I have some of my friends are settlers. That trope you always hear white people say is some of my friends are Indian or native. But on this end, it applies to us too. But there's a very real surface existence without any depth. Indigenous people, our oral histories of colonization and colonialism are still maintained in the household. Whereas in a settler household, it's the stories and narratives of the pioneer myth, or it's the stories and narratives of the American dream or manifest destiny, or, the Canadian dream or American dream that are maintained in the household. So there's a very different, real depth of understanding around what really took place here on this landscape. And again, as an educator, I argue constantly that settlers are the most miseducated people on our continent because they don't know the history. They haven't been exposed to the history. And that's really shooting Canada and the US in the foot, because, the reality is that because they're miseducated, they haven't received a quality critical education in general. Like, even in Canada, I think the illiteracy rate is like 48% or something, where they're not even engaging in text. They're not even engaging in theory. They're not even engaging in history. And, that shots the settler colonial state in the foot, because now, you're seeing a lot of them sort of come up with these far-fetched myths and even begin to counteract, the settler colonial project in really weird ways, like far right and, anti-vaxxing and all the conspiracy theories and things that you're seeing on TikTok. So yeah, we're in a situation where it's a really real big discomfort for them to want to dive into this. But they have to learn the history. And Indigenous people, we know the history. It's a lived experience. Like, these stories are told, as if they just happened yesterday, because in context to our nations, they did. Like, 500 years isn't a long time in the scope of, centuries and millennia. Right? Time immemorial is the phrase that you hear a lot of old people say up here. We've been here since time immemorial. Well, literally, colonization and colonialism happened yesterday in that regard, and it's still happening today. So, I mean, I'm one to tend to hold settlers' feet to the fire, and they know that. A little bit critical of my approach when it comes to talking about history and the politics and the reality of settler colonialism. But that also has to happen. Like we have to have these unsettling conversations and stand in the truth of who we are and what took place on this land.
Thank you, Rick. And I'm sorry I didn't introduce Rick. Rick is helping me from the background host to my first hosting. So yeah, I'd love to have Rick.
You're doing
Rick
good.
in here. You all know Rick.
Yeah, of course. But no, yeah, I think. Wait, sorry. Here, yeah, you're doing good. Sorry, my mic was far from my face. I think when we're talking about dialectical materialism, it's like how I picture it's like a mathy question. We have like economies, cultures, history, and when we talk about this situation, when it comes to PATSOCs or not non-native or settler, because not all non-natives are settlers, right? But so I think when we talk about especially settler comrades, settler allies, what they're missing, just like Mylan said, is that, and Jamo, is that they don't understand their own history, right? So now we have a situation where they don't understand their own history, so they specifically don't understand our history, right? And when it comes to materialism, it's a science. So if you're missing a piece of that the piece where you're supposed to help analyze situations, especially towards like a communist revolution, right, or a decolonial movement. If you have these pieces missing, then they're just gonna misstep. And I think the reason we're talking about this today is because a lot of people have been misstepping, and especially people close to us, especially, me, Yamo, so like people that have been on this podcast, people that just been around us, and we try to tell them, hey, you're misstepping as a comrade. But like, there's a certain point which, just some other questions, we probably have to say, hey, this guy is pointless. Worthless, not worthless, like like he's totally worthless, but like his ideas or his analysis is worthless, right? At this point, maybe he should take a step back, or they should take a step back, or she should take a step back, or whoever, whatever their pronouns are, and this, I'm not talking about one specific person, I'm talking about people in general, and follow indigenous and Black leadership towards the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And yeah, I think we covered the the primary contradiction really well there, and the background on that. Like some great contributions there. Before we get into, I guess, like in our context, I figured we kind of finish off with that. Oh, Mylan, please. Yeah, let Mylan get in here.
Yeah. I think one thing we have to do and acknowledge too is that obviously, when it comes to indigenous people in our territories, our roots are inherently deeper. Like they're the deepest when it comes to the lands and territories that we're living in. In context of North America, indigenous roots will always be the deepest. And so naturally, when we're looking at, how nationhood looks, how sovereignty looks, and autonomy discourse, then it's going to be very place specific. And I know we're talking about settlers in a general sense, but at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that they have to do the work to connect to the people in the territories that they're occupying. They have to do the work to actually connect to people, indigenous people. Otherwise, all settler colonial political parties are still settler colonial, right? Like all the political discourse, if it's coming from a settler perspective, is inherently settler colonial. And part of, connecting with indigenous people would be specifically jumping into the umbrella of those nationhood projects that exist specific to those landscapes. So I like how Yama was saying that, that a lot of the theories and the perspectives that influence Marx, Engels, and even Buchanan were basically interpretations of indigenous peoples. Well, if that's the reality, then those guys only got like the cliff notes. Like they only got like the echo and trickle down of, the reality of our matriarchies, the reality of our land-based governance systems and our communal systems. And the reality is a lot of indigenous people tied to their landscapes and their histories are still holding on to those projects because, like I said, in our oral history, there is a time coming where settler colonialism is inherently going to crumble, right? Like I said, like the last 500 years is only, it's a glimmer compared to, the thousands of years we've been here, the millennia we've been here. So the reality is we do have to position the reality that indigenous people know what they're talking about. And it's really relative to place. Geopolitics matter. And part of, I think, the inherent contradiction that exists is that they're attempting to generalize general theory and apply it to America or apply it to Canada. Well, that's still the settler state. That's still a settler colonial state.
Yeah, Victor, did you still have something?
Yeah. So one of the things that Rick had mentioned was, well, first I should say, Mylan, excellent points there. But Rick had mentioned, dialectical materialism, and to me, it seems like a lot of people don't understand how that works, or they understand it but they misapply it, or don't know how to apply it. And I can say that one of the people who has, more vocally been opposed to, anti-colonial thought in Marxism has been Caleb Maupin, and just a few weeks ago, he got in an argument with somebody, and throughout that argument, proved that he didn't understand what dialectical materialism was, and then tried to deny the existence of base and superstructure, like that they didn't matter, which is the fundamental building blocks of how that relationship operates. So I think it goes beyond just not knowing their history. I think a lot of these people are pretending.
Thank you, Vic. And I'll actually really quickly expand on that, on you and Mylan. Well, primarily Mylan's point of this is something that I think about a lot, is the history and the tradition of collectivism, and that, like, just to kind of expand on that point, is that, yeah, it seems like the history, and I guess, like, yeah, the history of collectivism throughout the globe, to me, in my understanding, is that it existed in many societies throughout history, and that where Marx was novel, like where he didn't invent collectivism, as Mylan was pointing out, he was observing in other non-European, primarily societies in the Western Hemisphere, and he took that, and where his theory is novel is that he took collectivism and he applied it to industrial society. Like, there was pre-industrial collectivism, and then industrial society, which only existed at this point in the Western Euro-colonial world. So that's primarily London. We know London is where the Industrial Revolution happened, as well as the United States, I guess Germany as well, and which was afforded to them through the colonial theft period and slave trade period of capital accumulation. So yeah, that to put, I think Marx is mysticized a lot and considered sort of like the founder of collectivism, when all he really did, not to downplay his contributions, because I consider myself a Marxist, but what he did was not invent collectivism, but just apply it to industrial society. And Victor, you got something?
Yeah. I just wanted to say that, like, you're correct there, that he he took what he learned about collectivism and applied it through dialectical materialism and through material analysis to industrial society. You are correct in saying that. And I think one of the interesting things is how easy that is to find. If you read Marx Ethnographic Notes, if you read Marx at the Margins by Kevin B. Anderson, this stuff is in there. It's in Marx's writing all throughout it, that he understood. He came to the understandings, specifically towards the end of his life, that the European historical model, which had defined most of his early work, was not a universal concept, that societies elsewhere had developed differently. Specifically, when you read his theories, his early theories, right, there was the early, the primitive tribalism, and then they moved into slave society, then they moved into feudalism, then they moved into capitalism, and he believed that from beyond that they would move into socialism. But that's not how it played out specifically on this continent, right? We never had the period of capitalism before we reached our period of collectivism. So he knew towards the end of his life that some of what he was writing down was incorrect, and he started to amend that shortly before he died.
Thank you. Very important history right there for understanding of Marx in general. Thank you, Victor. Does anyone else have anything to contribute to that before we move on to
Yeah, and also I think me and Rick talked about this. There's a cool video on YouTube by Twin Rabbits. Yeah, that where he talks about how Marx and Engels were looking at the work of Lewis H. Morgan, who was basically like this weird dude who was pretending to be Mohawk on weekends and stuff, like a hobbyist basically. But they read his work, and this Lewis Morgan had a friendship with what was his name again off the top of my head? Do you remember his name, Rick?
I think his name was Parker, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Because
it was Parker.
he was an ancestor of Arthur Coswell Parker, who was like also, I believe, this guy was Seneca. I'm fairly certain.
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah, and basically he was just jacking his information and coming up with this weird
Eli Parker.
Yeah, Eli Parker.
There you go. Yeah.
Eli Parker, and was just writing this information down as if it was his source knowledge and interpretation of Iroquois and Seneca kinship systems and governance systems, but he was just like freaking being a settler, like stealing shit and passing it off as his own. And unfortunately Marx and Engels read that and they sort of fused their perspective on it. And again, so in my mind, there's principles of it that are inherently wrong and based off a Eurocentric interpretation. So again, like this is why indigenous perspectives, indigenous language, indigenous knowledge systems are important, because we have the story, we have the language that could speak to that clearer than we could articulate in English, right? I operated on the premise that my ancestors are wiser than me, right? And that's the reality when it comes to our governance systems too.
All right. Before we move on to, I figured I feel like we could have a long period of just analyzing our situation here and what we've seen, our experiences with just organizing and just observing even the dynamics, the culture, you can call it quote unquote culture here in the Western Hemisphere. Recently, we did an interview with Dr. Horn, Rick and I, and Dr. Horn cited when I asked him about what his answer to the colonial and national question is in this on this continent, or even I think I asked in this specifically in the case of the United States, but I think that it all applies to the other settler colonies, Canada and Mexico. Like what is the answer to the colonial question? And he cited what for me was a very very important historical precedent set in Rhodesia, which I think illuminates this discussion about the colonizers' role in a national liberation struggle. I'd like to go over that and then a couple other historical examples. Just really quickly, Rhodesia, for those who don't know, was a British colony. It is now Zimbabwe. And there was a colonizer uprising where the colonizers, as happened in the United States, were trying to form their own state, independent of British rule, but still somewhat seemingly in the from my understanding under the British federalist system. But I think for us that's reminiscent of what it seems some of these our white socialist counterparts seem to imagine for this was not a socialist project, Rhodesia, but it was it's another settler project, another settler nationalist project, as Rick always does a good job of naming. But yeah, so I think that's the example. The reason he brought up that example is that there was the Lancaster Agreement in Britain, which after all the fighting between what became Zimbabwe, which was led, of course, by indigenous Africans, who became the nation of Zimbabwe. So there's a deal struck in Britain. There's an agreement in Britain to establish sovereignty for Zimbabwe, independent of Britain and independent of settler colonial rule. I think that gives us a good idea of what maybe we want on this continent. We want an agreement that guarantees sovereignty for indigenous nations. Everyone on this panel, I'm sure, is that that's what we're talking about indigenous sovereignty. First and foremost, that is to note, this will all get there, but I could just say it now, is like what we want, what our liberation struggle here is on this continent is first and foremost, primarily and wholly, this is a national liberation struggle. It's not forming a new socialist nation in a way it seems it is conceptualized by a lot of our comrades. We're liberating nations that already exist. The over 574 nations, indigenous nations, as well as many of us Black descendants of slavery want national sovereignty for our people as well. We want self-determination and national sovereignty unimpeded by European colonial society. So another historical example, two others I want to note really quick are well, first I'll say Algeria, and I think this is, if I could give a text that I think hits on this conversation that we're having, a book, it's A Dying Colonialism by Frantz Fanon, where he details the Algerian Revolution and the different parties that existed during that revolution, and where settlers, this is an example of where settlers, the colonizers, got the chance to, and many of them played a positive role in decolonization, and ended up disbanding some political parties and joining the National Liberation Front, the FLN. This is French, so it's like Front de Libération Nationale. So this, I think, is what our settler comrades need to look towards as to what they should eventually, how they can conceptualize things playing out here and the positive role that they can play in decolonization, and that they can organize, and that they can organize themselves, and as long as it ends up as a coalition whether they have to disband or not and become part of a national liberation front, I think that's how we need to conceptualize how things can progress here, where settlers and colonizers, our white comrades, can play a positive role, and it's not as maybe many of them seem to think, them forming a vanguard party maybe akin to what happened in the USSR, because that just does not, you can't, as Victor actually likes to say, and I think is such an apt description, control C, control P, copy paste Russian USSR conditions onto this country, this hemisphere, which just flat out just does not, that's anti-dialectical. It's not, that doesn't have to do with dialectical materialism. And before I hand it over to Victor, I want to give an example of where things could go wrong, similar to Rhodesia, but with South Africa. And I think this hits on Mylan's point about who owns all of the farmland in his territory. There's similar conditions in South Africa, where there's a lot of the Boers, as they're called, the white farmers in South Africa, own vast swaths of land. And that's a clear contradiction. That's a clear colonial contradiction that has yet to be resolved. And it leads to it's a contradiction that, as we can see, through the chants of indigenous South Africans, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, these become antagonistic contradictions if they are not resolved. So I think that's something we have to look to as a warning. I'll hand it over to Victor here.
Yeah, I just wanted to like touch on, me saying the Control C, Control V revolutionaries. The the interesting thing about primary contradictions is that they are different for every struggle. The primary contradiction for the Soviet Union was imperialism, because the first thing that happened after they had the revolution was they were imperialized. I think nine or 12 nations banded together and invaded them, including the United States, Britain, and some other, mostly Western European countries, if I remember correctly. And the same thing for, China, although China had some colonialism to deal with as well. I'm not sure how well they did. I'm not super versed on Chinese history. But depending on where you are in the globe and what your material conditions are, your primary contradiction can change. And this is another thing that they miss because they don't actually know Marx's work that well. For us to say the primary contradiction on the North and South American continents are colonialism, that doesn't necessarily track everywhere. For example, let's say I'm trying to think of a nation that's having political struggles right now. An African nation having political struggles against other Africans. The colonialism won't be the primary contradiction there. That's a class contradiction, right? That's capitalist versus people who want to move beyond capitalism. Here we have that on top of colonialism. We have imperialism on top of colonialism. Colonialism is the foundation which all of these things are built upon. And that's the thing that I feel like a lot of people are missing.
Thank you. And to prompt a discussion here for the rest of what I feel like we could do for the rest of the episode. Rick gave us some good prompts here. Generally, we could talk about the observations we've made of white comrades, of our white comrades here. We're all organized. We're all trying to organize. We're all trying to educate, agitate. What have we observed working with our white comrades? We could say specifically, Rick brings up, which is a very relevant and current topic, is Gerald Horne's work. That seems to have sparked a lot of conversation around this. And yeah, Rick, I think you want to contribute here.
Oh shit, I wasn't muted. Yeah, but I'm sorry. But I think I want to touch a little bit on what you said about like who owns, like in South Africa, who owns the farmland. But I think when it comes to talking about material conditions and materialism, we have to understand that, for decolonization to happen, we need to ask ourselves the questions about who owns the means of production. If the settlers maintain their means of production under communist, slogan, under the communist banner, the system will continue. So the system of settler colonization, the Native and Black communities need to have the means of production while respecting sovereignty, of Native people, Native communities. So I think that itself is a whole different episode, but we have to understand that is a very big question, right? But when it comes to the question, I'll start a little bit right now with the question about our comrades. I think we all had situations in our lives where, we can all talk. We don't have to name names or anything, but we all have situations in our lives where we work within settler institutions, which is hard. Mylon, you work within a settler institution right now. When I was back in undergrad in San Diego, I had a hard time because it was just, calling out pretendians or calling out racism within the institution. And the institutions always tokenize Native people that don't understand these issues, or brand new natives or some shit, So we're over here get labeled as like too aggressive or too radical, or or too whatever. That's just in institutions. Once you go on the grassroots level, it's just a mess. I think it's really hard to, because we're here trying to teach people about like our issues, history, and and then people are always asking you like, but who the fuck are you, right? And I'm just like, like they want you to have all these like degrees, all these credentials to like talk about like the topics, and and then there's going to be somebody that they will tokenize themselves, like, oh, I have this native friend here that thinks differently than you, that thinks the same as me, and I've dealt with that for like 20 years, right? So it's really like, it's hard because we're all navigating through these spaces, and I think sometimes we do have comrades that do understand, and they back us up, and I'm grateful for them, that the settler comrades and the non-native comrades. But I think sometimes they go astray, and I'm like, oh my God, like, do I have to hold your hand? Do I pull you back towards this position? And this is a conversation that I think we're going to have right now. So I think Victor has had his hand up. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say you made like a really good point there, about people wanting degrees and experiences and published works and everything, and the people demanding these from you see themselves as the leadership of a movement, and they have none of those accomplishments, and in fact they probably have less accomplishments that you do actually have. So I just think that's always a good laugh.
I don't know if I finished the prompt here, but we could get into Gerald Horne if we'd like. We could also everyone's response to Gerald Horne. If I'll note real quick that I've just found that he seems to elicit quite a violent reaction from a lot of people, it seems, who have a really hard time coming to grips with the colonial reality of this hemisphere and the sentiments of colonized people and Black people towards generally the situation here and what needs to be done, and the history. But yeah, here, Mylan, please take it away.
Yeah, and this is the problem that I grew up interacting with, was that it's really quick for, like, we always hear people talking about intergenerational trauma with, oppressed people, colonized people, residential school, boarding school. But it's wild how quickly settler colonialism and settlers who are complicit and unmindful resort to like an intergenerational violence. Like there's genocidal tendencies to go on the offensive. And I always wonder where that comes from, because we always know the answer is that it's colonialism. Like it's ingrained in the paradigm and the psyche, and it has to be deconstructed. And when on that episode with Gerald Horne, him highlighting how, that he's being attacked and things like that, it comes as no surprise that, that happens. So we have to be mindful. We have to be vigilant. We have to build strong, safe communities, not let your guard down, right? Because the reality is that settler colonialism and colonization did disrupt our ability to defend ourselves, did disrupt our ability to keep our community safe. So for me, primary discourse for me is also community safety. But with that being said, one of the concepts that has permeated this discussion that hasn't been openly said is that Indigenous people, we're a diplomatic people. Like we're a diplomatic people. And that's a modern contemporary word, diplomacy. I want to see more of our nations and more of our people engage in diplomacy, not as subservient to the settler state, not like as the savage coming out of the woodwork and performing or giving these romantic notions and singing songs. No, like we literally need to engage in diplomacy as nations again, as original nations, because we have now our narratives and histories of doing that. Like that's where treaty comes into play. Treaty was our people's effort to maintain diplomacy with one another, even pre-contact, like non-settler treaties with our own people, like treaties between different tribes. Like in our Cree oral history, we're fortunate enough to even know about the Comanche, about Rick's people. Like we still have the oral history of engaging with each other peacefully on the prairie. And that was rooted in diplomacy. That was rooted in, coming together and having a conversation about these things. And I feel that that's not happening. And if it does happen, it's coming under the settler colonial umbrella. And I really liked what Gerald Horne said about, the Lancaster meetings and going, potentially having to go to Madrid or England or Paris and sitting there as original nations, which our people have done in the past and attempted to do. But obviously neoliberalism and neocolonialism sort of, controlling the narrative now. But that diplomacy needs to happen again from the perspective of indigenous autonomy and sovereignty, Black autonomy and Black sovereignty in the Americas, where we're sitting down and engaging in diplomacy and having these bigger conversations, not the conversations that are like, I would argue that are a bit more social. I really want to drive and structure the political and economic infrastructure that's going to create strong nations again.
Yeah, I have something to say. I think Yamo has something to say, but I do want to jump really quick before Yamo to jump on what Mylan brought up about what Horne said about the Lancaster, meeting. I do think we obviously we need something like that. When the settler state crumbles and all the Native nations get together, we got to talk about how we're gonna maintain, or like decolonize. I don't think we should have it though. The only thing I disagree with, I don't know if Horne thinks we should have it in the UK or somewhere else. I think maybe we should have it here locally. These talks. I don't think we should go abroad for that. Like I don't give a fuck what the Europeans have to say about decolonization. We should have them like Albuquerque or some shit. I don't know. Just saying. So yeah. Yamo was next.
I like that. Real quick, what I want to highlight too is it's interesting how that narrative will, like up here in Canada, Canadians wouldn't be at that table. You know what I mean? Because Canadians are recent arrivals. They're recent creations rooted in their settler colonial myth. So it's like, yeah, I mean, we're not going to have it in Canada either, type thing. It's going to be here on our terms and like Indigenous territories under Indigenous diplomatic projects. Yeah.
Yeah, I was I'll speak to that real quick. I think that is happening. It's happening with relevant actors in this hemisphere, particularly with Cuba. During the pandemic, you have the United States sending indigenous nations fucking body bags and shit when they're supposed to be sending us PPE and vaccines and so forth. And, so these talks and relationships are going, much to the United States horror. Those conversations are happening on the Western Hemisphere, and they have been ever since time immemorial. We have the largest trade routes in history with that kind of thing. But I think the reason to go back to why Horne's being attacked and why sort of settlers whether they're even aware of it or not, sort of revert to this being threatened by, a Black man who not only is aware of his real identity, where he comes from, but is educated, right? So I think that's how people, people of color become tokenized so easily, is because, there's with the amazing lengths that these colonies have gone to eradicate our histories from our knowledge, eradicate our languages to our knowledge. There's not all of us, but a lot of us still have this whole process of development to be able to, understand the circumstances with us, to understand our material conditions fully. So typically it seems like what happens is you become aware of, your true identity, for people that weren't raised with it right off the bat, or people's families went through these boarding schools and so forth. So, you gain your understanding of who it is you are, you know what I mean? And I feel like this is the stage where you can be so easily tokenized, because, you understand, who you are in the context. But unlike, say, somebody who's gone to such a development educationally like Horn, or many of us here, you have to understand, you don't have the education to understand that, working within the construct of colonialism it's you're working against yourself, right? And I gotta say, God, I hate to be, a cis man in saying this right now in particular, but just in general, the missing and murdered indigenous peoples movement that's going on. I've sort of had a realization recently that horrifies me about it, because the struggle is absolutely real. We've been being murdered, particularly our women have been being murdered and abused, since colonialism began. But what are we actually asking? Like, what is our deliverable outcome that we want from that, right? So here you have a lot of people that have understood their identity in the context, and they're saying, hey, this missing and murdered indigenous people issue needs to be addressed. But how are we, without the education to understand the context fully, what are our asks? Who are we asking? And what are we asking for? And a lot of what I'm seeing from this movement is we're actually asking the FBI to come onto our lands and investigate our people. This is the result that's happening, right? The deliverable outcome is to ask our colonizers to, after the American Indian movement died, to get the FBI out of our lands. A lot of this seems to be the deliverable ask in the end of the day. And so I think, you got to have the full, you got to understand who you are, and be educated enough to understand who your enemies really are. You know what I mean? And then, and I think that's why people like Horn, I'm saying, in the American Indian movement and so forth, come under such attack, because once they really understand, once you really understand, and you understand that you're in the colonial context, we're surrounded on all sides by enemies, even including the delusional settler that sees themselves as a leftist. They see themselves as a leftist because, like I said earlier, maybe they're not a Republican or whatever they are, but they don't understand that they're still working on the framework of genocide and land theft and occupation, right? So it's just something I've been seeing lately, you know what I mean? And with like people like Deb Haaland right now being in such a high place within the colonial government, all of this, and a lot of Native people feel like this is a success and something that's going to be ultimately good for us. But what is the ultimate outcome of a Native face in a high place? The last big name person, the first Indigenous vice president in history, is responsible for writing bills to have our lands destroyed. You know what I mean? A token for our own destruction. So, so I think that's why Horn comes under such attack so quickly, is because not only is he aware of who he actually is after they've taken the human trafficked Africans family names from them, their language from them, after taking their history from them. He's reclaimed his identity. Not only has he reclaimed his identity, he's reclaimed the education to understand who his actual enemies are, right? And these delusional settlers that see themselves as leftists are threatened by that, because they, I guess on the flip side, if you're a settler, you have to come to the understanding, because essentially you have one of the most dumbed down populations on the face of the planet, right? That don't even know who they are. And this is just a root of, fascism. You go back to Rome, right? You're talking about an empire that stole Semitic people's religion and concocted an idea, and then went about eradicating the people they stole this identity from, right? The eradication of Semitic peoples and the people that they stole the Judeo religions from. Fast forward hundreds of years, and you have this fake identity, right? The white Christian, you know what I'm saying? Even the whole American identity is just a total facade, a total fictitious construct. The refugee fleeing religious persecution is just completely false. A bunch of poor white people that were wage slaves and under feudalist lords did not somehow come up with the money to come over here by the millions. Only the capitalist class, only the feudalist lords, only the capitalist class can afford to pay for the vessels to ship millions of wage slaves over here to build their colonies, right? So it's like you're dealing with the people that, their entire identity is a facade. So for the settler, that's a very difficult thing. You know what I mean? Because nothing is true. It's all lies, including who you are, right? That's so, you're talking about essentially what settlers have to do to be able to come over to our side and truly understand their role and their position inside of the colonial contradictions and the material conditions. Essentially, they have to go through an identity crisis. You know what I'm saying? That's not fun. You know what I'm saying? So you can see why so many are resistant to it, because they have to deconstruct everything they've ever been told from day one, and only then, can they truly be effective comrades and the struggle that they genuinely need to be fighting for, which is our liberation, right? So, which they have to give up all of their agency, you know what I'm saying? All of their benefits in order to truly be helpful in this situation. And it's hard to do. And, because of the just having individualism crowned down their throats for hundreds of years, they're very reluctant. The initial reaction is to fight back against it. They're thinking in their heads, I'm not a bad person. You know what I mean? I didn't have any choice in any of this matter. This is what I was told. And I feel like that's why it's so easy to default to the attacking position, which is the colonial position, when faced with that horrific reality, which is a total injustice to be done to them, but it was done to them by their oppressors, which are their own people, their capitalist masters and the feudal lords and the Romans that built this horrific, fascist ideology. So, anyways, I just wanted to speak to all that.
Thank you.
I'm gonna
Thank you.
I'm gonna try and keep this short so that Mylan can get in here. But when you were talking about the Lancaster agreements before, and you were suggesting places where we could meet, the only place in Europe that I would even consider is Ireland, and the reason for that is because they have consistently recognized our struggles and been allies to us. Anywhere else in Europe can eat my ass. Secondly, secondly, one of the things that you had brought up I might have lost it because you were on fire for a long time. One of the things that you had brought up was people advocating for bringing the FBI and settler law enforcement back onto our territories. That's something that's being discussed right now in the Seneca Nation, considering giving New York State and or FBI access to our territories. This is something that I think all of us should fight against. They don't need to be there. We not only have our own ways of doing things, we have our own laws, we have our own court systems. There's no reason why we can't come up with our own enforcement policies. And thirdly, I don't know where Mylan's going, but I was going to try and keep this on the topic of Gerald Horne. One of the things that I've noticed in engaging with some of these people that are able to at least keep a level head about it is that when you ask them what their criticisms of Horne are, it generally focuses on one book. And when you ask them for specifics, they can't really nail down a specific, but they can dance around it. That like they feel like something that he's portraying in this one specific text out of 40 plus books that he's written portrays some historical things incorrectly, meaning that Horne interprets words that are said in documents different than they do. It's really a weak criticism, and not many of them can even make it. Like I said, they sort of danced around it. They're like, "Oh, this is inaccurate," and it's like, when you know about other parts of history, specifically American history, when you look at his other works, which they claim that they have no problem with his other works, and you understand how he writes, it kind of falls apart pretty quickly.
Yeah, a bunch of facile arguments, huh?
Can I say something to that? I feel like, the patriotic socialists or whatever are coming from a right-wing position. So, I mean, honestly, they're just decrying fake news. You know what I'm saying? And it's about as simple as that. As long as they could just label whoever's, critiquing, their flawed position. All they need to do is find one little grain and a little slogan to try and put that person's critique, devalidated or whatever. And also, I wanted to say one more thing about the Supreme Court just ruled about states' dominion over indigenous nations. It's a big, really big fucking ruling and a massive, massive blow to indigenous sovereignty, right? So here, right in the middle with this right-wing fascist Supreme Court, unelected Supreme Court, ruling that these states, and that was kind of, it was such a big deal. The fact that states prior to this decision, we actually did have sovereignty from the states, not from the federal government, right? Well, those states are gone now because of the Supreme Court. Right in the middle of this crisis of the missing and murdered indigenous people, not only have essentially we lost our sovereignty to the states, but we're actually asking them to bring the FBI in. It's just, the timing is horrific. And the ruling, the fact that, of course, settlers don't even know and don't give a flying fuck about this massive blow to our sovereignty, but it's one of the biggest, worst things that's happened to us in a long time, and it's a huge deal. So, all right, I'm done.
I like it. I like it all. Yeah, it's interesting to hear that, the only argument coming out of settler leftists towards Gerald Horne is a language argument. Like, oh, you're not using the language properly. It's like that's the most like settler colonial thing you could say to indigenous and black people in the Americas, because it's not our fucking language. You know what I mean?
Yeah, semantics, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then also, like, I like how Yamo brought up this notion of settler labor, and I think that really shows up in mobilizing and in leftist circles in general, as they identify with labor, and it becomes almost like the main argument in terms of their mobilizing. And as indigenous people, we have a completely different take on labor. Like we weren't necessarily our job, you know what I mean? And that we had these communal systems, these collective systems. And there's research coming out that's saying that, you know, indigenous people had a lot of downtime to share stories and to, you know, do knowledge creation and pass down their oral histories. And part of that is because we don't come from a culture of forced labor or wage labor or feudalism, right? And keeping in mind that, you know, the argument I would say to the settler leftists critiquing Horn on language, illiteracy in Europe existed for like centuries, right? For centuries. And our people, we've learned, you know, multiple colonial languages in a couple decades, if that, you know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, put that in your notebook and and keep record of that. Because the reality here too is that, you know, we're actively engaging and fairly recent to these conversations, and the ideas are fresh. The indigenous ideas are fresh. Our takes are pretty new, and we're capable of navigating forward. And you know, the fact that, you know, we're being critiqued that we're doing it wrong, or the fact that we're being critiqued as not being inclusive to the settler presence. No, I think we're fairly inclusive, and you know, on a good note, I feel like we're definitely doing it right. In a general trajectory, we're going in the general trajectory, and of course, you know, in a trajectory, not everything is as fluid as it could be, but I think we're kind of going down that route. And then the other thing with police, to build on the 2 points, is that we had an interesting situation this last winter here in a community, James Smith Cree Nation, where there was basically a rampage, and a young individual ultimately, you know, stabbed a lot of people. And you know, some of the takes, not so well informed takes, was that we need more police, like in our rural communities. That was the argument coming up, and even to the argument of saying we need indigenous police, which I'm critical of, because I feel like we didn't necessarily have, we had these legal systems and people who maintained the legal system. I think like the contemporary argument would be more than a police force, you know, where we would have a structure that does more than what a police force would do. But the settler state, you know, weaponized that and are creating a new provincial police force based off those requests and calls. So they're weaponizing our calls for help constantly, and you know, they'll position as if they're helping, but the reality is there's always, you know, some secret agenda that's taking place, and that's not a conspiracy theory. That's a fact. That's a fact in the history of the Americas. Is they'll give you something, but you know, there's something attached to that. So, you know, this call for policing, I think I'm really critical of too. And if anything, you know, we need community care, we need community defense, we need, you know, an ecological system that takes into account, you know, the panoramic view of the chaos our communities are going in. And I don't want to get like too militant or, you know, advocate for anything like that openly in it. But the reality is that those projects will be far more substantive than the creation of a police force. They will be much more grounded in the community and more practical than what cutting and pasting a settler colonial police force would look like.
Yes, I think I was next. Okay, I'll go ahead, Yama, and then I'll go after you.
I was just gonna say, it's like they take all of our resources away from us. They put us in desperation and poverty, and then when, you know, the patriarchy and the violence and everything that they've drilled into our heads, when things happen, the only answer they have for us is to give up more of our agency to them. You know what I mean? And you know what I'm saying? The only answer is more cops. You know what I'm saying? And what we actually need is our land, our resources, you know what I mean, back, so that we can provide the real services that would prevent a lot of these things from happening. You know what I mean? But the only answer they'll ever give us, even if they put a native face on it and have Deb Holland go in there and go, yeah, more cops, more FBI, you know, the only answer is give up more of your agency. You know what I mean? That's the only answer they ever had for us.
And that even translates into more funding too, right? There's always a catch to the funding. Like the neoliberal era is always like saying, well, we'll throw money at the problem, but that doesn't solve shit.
I think, you know, what, especially when it goes back to I Don't Know More, or any other movement, you know, when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women, I think I used to bring up the topic of sovereignty, because it's, you know, we as Native people in the U.S., I'm not sure in Canada, but in the U.S. legally, we cannot prosecute non-natives for anything over than a misdemeanor. right? And nothing over than 5 years. And I think it's like the limit is like $50,000, some shit like that. So obviously our sovereignty is like, it's almost like a sovereign apartheid, right? Like where the US government is a guardian of war, obviously, but our sovereignty is second rate. It's like a second rate citizen here in the US. So when this situation started becoming popular online, I told people, hey, this is a sovereignty issue. If we're able to prosecute non-natives, it's just the dynamics would change. We will need the FBI coming onto the reservation. We can, prosecute non-natives ourselves, but that requires making our sovereignty stronger, right? And that would require, and that would eventually lead to decolonization, because not only would we prosecute non-native like murders, rapists and all this stuff, but we would also prosecute corporations, right? For being on our land, polluting. We'll prosecute the governments, local government officials. And it's a slippery slope that the government doesn't want, right? So, I think Jamo has something to say, but I do want to say, piggyback back and forth. You want, Jamo? You want something to say or not?
Well, the epiphany I had on this came from the other day. A tribal chairman was on the local Reading News talking about missing and murdered Indigenous people, and they edited out, they selectively edit out the things that that he said, and what ended up being on the news that all the settlers watched, right? They selectively chose out, this is a crisis situation, and then they skipped. You could see the editing in it, and he said, "And it's our own people doing it to us sometimes, and that's sad, right?" And like this was what was on the news. The only thing that maybe all these settlers have ever even heard about this thing was that Indigenous people are killing each other, right? And then there's basically a call for the FBI to step in, right? And that's when it dawned on me, and I'm like, this is fucking horrible. You know what I mean? Because, and that's when it dawned on me. So I'll just give you context for where my concern finally popped up, because I've been involved in a lot of these protests to try and raise awareness and to get funding for Indigenous nations to do something about this. But just seeing how it's been played out, what the real deliverable asks are, keep going back to asking the federal government and shit to step in and investigate Indigenous people. And just the way it's being portrayed, it's scary to me. So I just wanted to give you that context.
Yeah, I think that goes to like the rock, the cornerstone of this is our sovereignty, and which is also the cornerstone to decolonization, which is also the cornerstone for Black liberation and Black sovereignty and Black nationhood on this continent, right? So this conversation, I keep fucking harping on it over and over. Like that's the fucking teacup meme with a cup overflowing. I keep harping about this, right? But I want to talk about Joe Horn, and I think one of them, who was it said that, was it Victor that said that their talking points were just like the seller talking points were like they danced around it, but because Gerald Horn, I think he even admitted in other interviews, not just in mine, is that he wished he can talk more about Native issues, but it's just fine. I mean, he doesn't have to because we're here, but I would say too, what he does talk about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, right? And that is so fucking important to Native history, because it's like Gerald Horns is like what he talks about, right? He writes about as a puzzle piece to a history. And if you get Native history, and he says the Royal Proclamation, that it fits perfectly in that puzzle, right? So people have to understand what the Royal Proclamation was and how it played into Native history, like the Revolutionary War. That, to me, in my point of view, that was one of the reasons, that settlers decided to revolt against the British rules, because the monarch put limits. They couldn't go past the Appalachian Mountains. They couldn't go westward they couldn't make treaties, like individuals couldn't make treaties with natives. The first case within native law was about, could we go in treaties with native nations as individuals and not the state, right? That's the first case, right? So it was Johnson versus McIntosh, right? Johnson versus McIntosh. Sorry, I'm brain farting right now. But that's the first case of the Marshall Trilogy. So you have to go Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. We have to go Worcester versus Georgia, right? And all these things, which started with the Royal Proclamation. So, like I said, people don't know fucking history. And this is like native law 101 in this fucking country, right? But people don't know it because they get taught about like really shitty history, like Squanto and like Pocahontas and the fucking movie with the in the cartoon movie, and it's just like really shitty stuff, or the shit to see on TV that's racist as shit, like the fucking Peter Pan movie, animated movie, and I think that's all they know. They know, I've been told, by people, they're like, there's no such thing as like natives anymore or some shit, or like there's no such thing as full bloods, and blood quantum is a whole nasty thing, but we can. That's a whole different episode. But my thing is, people say this stupid shit. As I said before, when I go overseas, sometimes people tell me I can't be native because they're all extinct. So there's really, really shitty things about native people. But our history is something that people don't give a shit about. I mean, this is American history. You would think these like redneck Americans would be like, yeah, I want to learn history, but they don't. They just want to learn like blanketed, vague history that paints their fucking country as like revolutionary when it wasn't. It's bourgeoisie, fucking capitalist garbage movement. I wouldn't even call it
counter-revolution, right?
Yeah. So I don't know who had their hand up first, Victor or you, Derek. But yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
I think Derek did, but the only thing I had to say was pretty quick. So like the city that I live in was under indigenous control or at least partially indigenous control until 1783.
Yeah, no, please, Mylan, you go next, please.
Yeah, the Royal Proclamation is really big up here too, because I mean, we cite it and make reference to it in terms of treaty and treaty arguments, in terms of obviously being, I don't want to say in quotations, recognized as nations, right? But the reality is that we were nations. And then I think one of the most overlooked like indigenous projects in the Americas, in terms of like even our own people not realizing, is Tecumseh. Like, you're looking at what he was trying to mobilize and organize, because he was fully conscious of the French and English playing their nationalist game and trying to come into the territory and the presence of the Americans. And man, he organized like people. And like in my mind, like in the multiverse theory, we got like the non-Tecumseh multiverse. Like we're dealing with the fallout of like, his brother making a major mistake and, choosing to fight the Americans without the backing of everybody. But like that's what I recently, like last like month, I've been looking into it and reading it again, because I'm like, man, this was like the potential. Like I wish we were in that timeline, because man, he was onto something there. And even in terms of sovereignty, like he was conscious of sovereignty. Like I feel like he would have created potentially like a state project, and people out on the prairie and plains, we wouldn't have encountered Americans. We would have encountered like Tecumseh's diplomatic project. And it was an interesting time. So yeah, that Royal Proclamation really played into how he was mobilizing and organizing. Yeah. So yeah, for listeners, I mean, look into that. I mean, we need more people talking about Tecumseh in my mind.
So before we go, sorry. Before we move forward, I have an episode is Native sovereignty or history of federal Indian law, as episode 51 or 50, 51, 52 or something like that, right? Where I have Professor Lindsay Robertson on the program, and you can go to the University of Oklahoma and they have a whole thing of the Marshall Trilogy themselves. So you can go listen to that shit. You don't have to go on my shit. The University of Oklahoma has a good Marshall Trilogy history videos, right? Please do that shit.
Yeah, check it out. And then like even to add to, well, I don't have the permission to share the story in terms of the community and the person, but to add to that from the indigenous perspective, is there's still communities that sing the same songs they were singing at the time of Tecumseh and still do the same dances and know the history. In my mind, that's like when I experienced those communities, I was like, God damn, this is badass. Like this is like history alive and well. Like we're not gone. Like we're not gone for real. Like we're still here. Like the project's there. We just need to pick it up again.
Yeah, I'd like to say, yeah, Tecumseh, one of the goats, in my opinion. And yeah, like an example, like you're saying, Mylan, I think he's an example that we should follow, like in terms of creating a model of like a federation of indigenous nations fighting against colonialism. And to me, it's reminiscent of Gaddafi in Africa and what he was about to do, what Hillary Clinton and Obama's administration robbed Africa of a potential United States of Africa, where Africa could get together and lobby for their interests, and become a trade bloc and and unified under the premise of advancing their interests as Africans, because as we know, with AFRICOM and just numerous other meddling by Europe and Europe's settler colonies, it desperately needs to be able avenues to be able to protect itself as the indigenous people on this continent could benefit greatly from something like Tecumseh, from something like that, a United States of, for lack of a better term, Turtle Island, but like, the indigenous peoples of this continent could get together and, as Tecumseh was trying to do, and lobby or fight for their interests. For yeah, like I'd like to I fit just to make sure we get to, unless anyone has anything else to add, I'd like to get to what Rick was. Rick had some great prompts for us for this, getting to, which I think this all leads very. It's an excellent lead into talking about how this applies to the context of our current organizing and what the project is here. Like, what are we doing? What are all of our organizations doing? I mentioned earlier that what I see is people just flat out missing the point. Non-natives in general, like not even just white people, not even just our white comrades, but non-natives in general, our Asian comrades, our immigrant comrades from all over, like Black comrades even, not getting the point. We touched on the last episode Rick and I did, we touched on New Africa, the concept of New Africa, and how it just it itself in the models that are drawn up engage in essentially indigenous erasure of indigenous peoples. Like, just to say that as a black descendant of slavery myself, whose family's 40 acres is there on that land that was given to us after slavery in Louisiana. I have misgivings with that model of New Africa, and the fact that it impedes on indigenous sovereignty. If we could talk in general, I'm going to bring up Rick's prompt here. He's asking where we could talk about. Sorry, one moment here.
I do want to say before, while you're looking,
it's
not that we're like, I don't know, I'm not against a black state, like New Africa here. It's just that I think that there's a disconnect. This is why I actually created this podcast, right? Because I was working with a Black Lives organization in San Antonio, and there was I felt like that we needed a bridge for we need a bridge for decolonization within the Black communities and Native communities. Because the moment you tell Native people, like, hey, we're going to create a whole new state or a whole new, sovereign nation within this continent that is not indigenous, they're going to be like, why? Right? But it's because Native people don't understand the material conditions of these, I think, as they should, of these, the black people that were brought here, Africans who were brought here through enslavement. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. So I support the creation of a black a black sovereign nation or New Africa, whatever it was called. But the only thing I disagree with is creating a black belt like it did the Communist Party. I think Victor or Derek know more about that, right? But I think because it's very limiting, and there's native nations in these territories in the South, so the Cherokee Nation's one of them, right? And I think but I think it should be a kind of like, I mean, like, for example, I would say Comanche Nation. I mean, Comanche Nation is based out of Lawton, Oklahoma, but we have Comanches in all 50 states, right? We represent Comanches in all 50 states. We don't need to be, not all Comanches don't need to be living in Lawton, Oklahoma for them to be considered Comanche, right? And on top of that, 50% of Comanches don't live in the local territories, right? Where a lot of the 50% are non-locals, right? Doesn't mean they're not Comanche. So you say same thing with the obviously with the New Africa. I mean, black people are everywhere in this country. We shouldn't just say, hey, go back to the South and blah blah blah. No, they can live wherever they do, go have relationships and families wherever they do. I mean, some of them are we have Afro-Indigenous people in the West. You're going to tell them to go to South? No. I mean, I think that concept of interliving together, I think people just need to learn about sovereignty, like I said, the cornerstone, and learn how the system could be could exist without, because I think that the whole thing with the Black Bloc was created at the same time the conversation of Aslan, which was like an ethno state. Aslan is totally different conversation, but it's an Chicano ethno states. And we're not here to create ethno states. We're here to build a movement together, to move forward together, to respect both our sovereignties, not to create an ethno state on top of native land, right? So yeah, that's put a disclaimer out there for people listening. They're like, what the fuck? Yeah.
Just to say, and I totally agree, and that's we've talked a lot, the two of us, about that, and our agreement in that, and that just because we don't agree with that model doesn't mean we don't want Black national sovereignty. I am very much of the tradition of the Black Panthers, and that's what I'm fighting for. One of the things I'm fighting for, what we're all fighting for here, I think we all agree. We all want Black national sovereignty, and we all recognize that we deserve self-determination and nationhood. Victor, please take it away.
Yeah, I basically just wanted to bounce off what you were saying and then sort of double down on what Rick was saying here, is that it's not really realistic to expect all of Black people on this continent to just move and move from wherever they are, wherever their community is, wherever their neighborhood is, wherever their families are, and just all move into Atlanta, Georgia, wherever the capital of this idea of New Africa or the Black Belt is going to be. It's completely unrealistic. It's highly disruptive. It's very similar to what the Europeans did to European Jews, putting them in the middle of Palestine. It's just not a great idea. I think that Black people differ by region culturally. They have their own, language terms. They have their own sort of dancing, food. They are completely organic people to this continent, because when they got here, everything was ripped away from them and they were left blank. This is something that, Anglo people don't have, and immigrants don't have that problem, right? So realistically speaking, there should be not one Black nation, but more than one Black nation, right? And my only problem with the idea of calling something like that New Africa is because that's a colonial tradition. These lands already have names. I'm not big on changing that, but Black people should have their own nations here. And to me, they're not that different from us in terms of their position in the anti-colonial struggle, because Black culture is organic here, right? And I'm not talking about just Black people in terms of appearance. I'm talking about Black people in terms of those that were ripped away from their homelands and brought here.
Thank you, Victor. Yamo, you want to take it away from there?
There we go. Yeah, I've made some connections in the past that have kind of gotten traction with people, just because these are things that we're going to have to discuss once we finally demolish this fascist colony, right? And as you know, you mentioned the Black Panthers. You know, they refer themselves to themselves as a Black colony, the displaced nation from Africa that was human trafficked here on this massive scale, right? And I think a modern iteration of what we're talking about, you can see in the discussions that happened from the African People's Socialist Party. I say, they're one of the few non-native socialist parties or whatever here that, they identify the primary contradiction. They advocate for the abolition of the United States and the sovereignty of indigenous nations, right? And they advocate for their own self-determination, as they should, right? And so I've made connections about, the Jewish autonomous oblast in Russia that the Soviet Union created, the first Jewish state, right? It was in 1929, so it was just 9 years after the foundation of the Nazi Party, right? These are the discussions we need to be having with our comrades, with our African comrades, right? And I basically agree with what everybody said so far. We just need to all get to what are we doing? Somebody mentioned earlier, what are we doing? And I feel like, I'm in, so-called California. And here, the best organization I have to work with is the Peace and Freedom Party and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, right? So I organize with them, right? However, whatever organization you're organizing with, right? These are still the conversations we need to be having as we're amassing our numbers, right? Like that's what Marx said, right? The reason that you have a third party or whatever is to count your forces, right? To build your numbers, right? Because we're going to have, not for winning elections, but for the physical conflict that is going to be brought upon us, just simply by once we've gained the numbers, the violence will be brought towards us, right? And we will have to defend ourselves by any means necessary, because the fascists will use any means necessary against us, as like Malcolm X said, right? So, whatever organization you're choosing to organize with, wherever you're at, to bring all these voices that need to be at the table, and particularly the voices of African and indigenous people. You know what I mean? But these are the conversations that we need to be having, right? And I think one of the most simplest answers, but seems to be the most hardest for settlers to grasp, is that the only answer to decolonization is like mass deportation of like 220 million Europeans, right? Which is A, impossible, right? And B, like not necessary, right? But in reality, in any other nation that you go to in the world, okay, this is like the difference between immigration, right, and colonialism, in my mind, right? I don't know if this is like textbook definition correct or whatever, but in my mind, the difference being is when you immigrate to a country or a nation, you become a citizen of that nation, right? And for some reason, when I discuss this with settlers, it's like so hard for them to fathom, right? It's like, the Mohawk Nation, right? Or like there's indigenous nations out there that are doing this, not really adopting people, citizenship, right? It's like the most basic thing about nationhood, right? Citizenship, at least in the modern or aspect of it or whatever. So it's like, say there becomes a sovereign African state or nation within our continent, or north or south, right? Like, it's not that hard to piece together what would just naturally occur, which is that African people or any non-native people, right, that aren't in whatever that specific autonomous region or whatever that is simply just become citizens of whatever nation they're in, just like anywhere else in the world. You know what I mean? And I'm sure naturally we'll be able to be a part and participate in the governments of those nations, despite being non-native or whatever, just like happens in any other nation in the world. So it's only kind of seems to me like the logical progression, but it seems when I discuss these things with non-natives, that this just seems to be a hard concept to grasp. And to me, it seems like sort of basic and the inevitable conclusion. All right, that's all I wanted to say.
I do want to jump in there real quick, just make a real quick comment. And people, when they when I talk to settlers or non-natives, I use myself as an example. One, I'm a citizen of the Comanche Nation. Two, I'm a citizen of the U.S. government. Three, I'm a citizen of the Mexican, I'm a citizen of Mexico. Shit happens like that, right? So, and I have proof. I have my passports, right? So, like, this can happen. Like, somebody in a decolonial state, you can be a citizen of your, native community. You can be a citizen of the decolonial state, right? Except settlers or these people that stayed here because of settler colonization, they won't be citizens of they won't be citizens of native community. They'll be citizens of the decolonial state. But we can go into that later. But I think you had other topics, Derek. So yeah. Oh, Mylan has his hand up. I don't know.
Yeah, that it's interesting for me to have this conversation too, because nationhood, if that's something we grew up on, was hearing our intention to want to start looking at early peace and diplomacy through treaty as a crutch for our people to figure out how to move forward and live together in modernity. But one of the interesting conversations that I feel we have to acknowledge too is this notion of borders too, how they've been created and maintained, like border imperialism. Like, borders are inherently tied to capitalism and the capitalist state, and they're maintained like through very real, geopolitical global politics and globalization. And to me, I'm really I'm kind of skeptical of anything that really tries to stamp out a land and a territory. Because even in pre-contact Americas, territories are very fluid. Like for example, we knew Rick's people from interacting with each other in Montana. Territories overlap, and the alternative reality to like a nationhood project that is like cut and paste border and things like that. I agree with what Yamo was saying, is that we have to come together and have these conversations to see how that world looks and how it ultimately even functions. And part of that, I think the skepticism is that people, their capital and their social capital is at stake, like their wealth's at stake, their labor is at stake when we're trying to create these alternative projects. And it's so hard for them to wrap their head around the reality that, no, we're going to create systems that take care of everybody, not just you. And I think that's the bottom line to looking at like the alternative decolonial reality, is what project's going to meet the needs of the people, which project's going to ensure that we're all fed and housed. And that's the bottom line for it. And yeah, like any kind of conversation that I think gets critiqued as being like, cut and paste Western border and nation, I'm skeptical of those conversations. But the bottom line for me is, yeah, we're just envisioning and wanting to create the alternative reality that we're living in today.
Thank you guys. And if I could like maybe lead off into the end, further into this discussion on organizing, because we were going to get into organizing with our white comrades, I guess, specifically, and like maybe even just non-natives in general, and helping them, educating them and organizing with them, and how that leads into, as we're discussing here, the vision for the future, like what kind of state or states or union of states are we creating. So for me, it's like to bring it back around to Algeria and how they had numerous parties, as detailed. I'll mention again the book, the Fanon's, is like his last book. I think maybe he had some other writings that were compiled afterwards, but yeah, A Dying Colonialism is the book, and where he's talking about the Algerian Revolution and how settlers were involved in a lot of these parties. And when it came to the point of all of them having to disband, the individual members joined the National Liberation Front. So as far as how organizing looks, I think it's like Yamo touched on. We're working with all of these different organizations with the shared common goal of socialism. Ideally, I mean, we could go across tendencies, I think, as long as we don't compromise our principles and our convictions. But generally, we're trying to create a system that works for everyone and cares for everyone. And I think that, just as in Algeria, that entails working with a number of different organizations, creating a broad coalition, and that we're looking for this to eventually dissolve into a national liberation front. Because as I mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, this is a national liberation project. We're liberating nations that already exist. This isn't the creation earlier. And I've seen a lot of this is people creating USSA flags and their idea of communist United States. And, that's like a Patsock thing. But like, I think it's generally what kind of people with socialist leanings without an anti-colonial understanding kind of conceptualize it. Like, oh, there's going to be this state that has no indigenous character to it. Essentially, it's not an indigenous nation that for just further encroachment on indigenous sovereignty under a different name, under maybe a socialist or communist name. So yeah, like, and maybe if any of you want to get into your thoughts on organizing and what that all looks like, building that coalition, and how it leads into your vision for the future, and what perhaps a broad coalition, a national liberation front, where we can create perhaps a multinational state, like a collectively governed continent that works for everyone, works for all nations. Mylan, take it away, please.
Yeah. So coming from like the Northern Prairie, the Plains, and obviously from a people who have a treaty with, the British Crown, which Canada hates, and actively tries to disrupt. For me, like for our nationhood project, like for me, like I always say, like I know there's some scholars out there who are anti-decolonization, or who say we need to renegotiate or question the intention of our ancestors to have these agreements. Like I always position myself as I'm not smarter than them. Like they were fluent in their language, they knew their histories, they knew their knowledge systems, and a lot of it was pretty much intact prior to residential school. But when you really hear like the peace and diplomacy project from our narratives and our perspectives, so not like the written document of treaties that, you know, Canada or the English have, but from our perspective in terms of negotiations, it was a pretty cool project in terms of shared resources, shared land. Like even there's even arguments that, you know, open access to education was a main principle. There's even arguments that, you know, healthcare, open access to healthcare, free healthcare was a principle that was being advocated in our territories. And you hear like, you know, these leftist talking lines that sort of bring up, you know, tuition and healthcare for everyone. Well, we already thought of that like in the 1870s. Like we already had these concepts and principles of how to live together on a shared landscape. So for me, nationhood and you know this multinational coalition project for this territory for me is going back to that in terms of sharing the resources, sharing the land, creating these systems of sustainability. And you know the big thing that I think we're not even acknowledging in this conversation is climate change. Like the reality of that, you know, climate's really going to disrupt, you know, settler colonial industries, especially on the prairie. Like, you know, a couple droughts back to back and, you know, agriculture is disrupted. So for me, like we're going to have to foster and maintain these very communal, collective approaches that are rooted in peace and diplomacy, and you know build up from that foundation first and foremost. So what's the treaty relationship in our territory? Like how do we go about that? Like being in mindful these really core indigenous concepts and principles that we talk about today here, that, you know, there's writers writing about it. Like Sylvia McAdam has a book, Nationhood Interrupted, with that intention of, you know, this was the peace and diplomacy project here. This is what we agreed to. But it gets dumbed down on the settler colonial side of things. And like many don't know what treaty is. Many don't know what peace and diplomacy is. And they don't embody those principles. And for me, it's still like I operate on the principle, my land, like our land, our rules type thing. Your land, your rules type thing in terms of other indigenous territories. But in terms of treaty territory, like the peace and diplomacy project was pretty interesting to see from our perspective. So it goes back to that for me. Like I really have to position that. Otherwise, yeah, I might get called out on my people. But yeah, I do believe in peace and diplomacy and that these goals are achievable.
Awesome, Rick. Thank you. That's love it all. Rick.
Yeah, I think you know, I think for people who are settlers, especially settlers who are listening or non-natives, I would say when because, you know, not all, I'll say this, when a native or black person comes to a space, you know, kind of like learn. I'm not saying let them lead the organization, right? Because there's some native people that are reactionary as hell, you know, or not Marxists, and I'm just like, I cringe at it, you know, when they come in, decolonize this and decolonize that. What they treat it as a buzzword, right? But I think no, when you encounter natives, you know, or you know, black radicals, black native radicals or Marxists that, you know, obviously are read, they understand theory or whatever, you listen or ask for advice, you know. I think also when we talk about decolonization, settlers, especially Europe, Anglo Americans or Anglo settlers, right, are going to have to create new community systems within themselves, because right now they're just rallying around settler nationalism, and I think their sense of community is like fucked in my point of view, because like some of them, you go outside, you wave at your neighbor and they're settlers and they don't wave back, or they only like go to get together for HOA meetings and they talk shit to each other. I had that experience. It's horrible. Right? And or they just, or they only get together for when, you know, when they're like in militias and shit, and then that's like white nationalist shit. So get together, create community that's not revolving around wearing hoods, you know, like being community with other people, you know, other people of color, other. Don't just, you know, if you're so proud of being Anglo, then you can go back to Europe. There's a fucking place called Europe. You can go back. You know, I'm not gonna kick you out, but you know, if you want to go back, it's cool, man. Like if you're that proud and shit, go back. But just build community. There has to be new ways of community. The other advice is too, you can't copy and paste native people's communities as your own and cultures. That's not how you do it. And when I was living in Seattle, there was, you know, there was I Don't Know More, you know, when I Don't Know More was new, and there was a young, you know, settler activist there, and she was like, you know, hey, you know, all we have to do is copy native people's culture and it will be decolonize. And I was like, that's not how it works. You know, it's not how it works. So don't do that, please. You know, but just I think the number one thing I would advise or recommend is for sellers to read history. Right? But without history, you're not going to have a good analysis on the material conditions of today. And if you don't understand history, you're going to have a bad analysis, and you're going to end up like Hinkle, Maupin, all these past talks we talk about, and and our, or even our good comrades that not good. I don't know if good is a good word, but are people that have been on this show that are sellers that go astray. I think you would not understand that you will have a shitty talking points against Orn or whatever, but I think and ask questions. I mean, like a lot of our native communities, we have our own historians, right? Read our books, man. Like, there's a lot of nations, so there's a lot of books to read. And you're not gonna be a perfect Marxist right away. It's gonna take time. Shit takes time. So yeah. I think Victor has his hand up.
Before I get into where I think we were headed, I just want to touch on what Rick just said. Is like, yes, we absolutely have our own historians. They have published works. Even though we are people who generally engage in, spoken history, oral history, there are people who do things in a way that an Anglo would find more acceptable to the way that they operate. The very first president of the American Anthropology Society was Seneca. So they exist. They were involved in history on this continent since the beginning. The problem is that there wasn't that many of them. So they got overlooked. They got trampled over by people with less accurate interpretations of events. And then secondly, I'd like to say, because I feel like we were getting into a discussion about like how we view a path forward. In my opinion, and this is why I like what Mylan said about Tecumseh earlier, is I find his call for what seems like a confederation of indigenous nations, which was a concept that was already in practice in smaller scale on this continent, specifically with the Haudenosaunee, my people, is a good model. I think it's an excellent model for us to use. I think it's one that we should pursue. I know in discussions that I've had with Yamo prior to this, that was something that he agreed upon, and he might want to touch on it as well. But I don't see how that couldn't that isn't the way forward, really, in my honest opinion. How do you maintain national sovereignty, national identity, the creation of decolonial states for Black people without that kind of process? It just, to me, seems like pie in the sky without it, without the process of confederalism. And it completely, in my opinion, flies in the face of the European systems of governance, which seem to centralize, centralize under a specific class, which sounds strange for a Marxist to say, but because we're dealing with multiple different nations here, neighboring nations that already have relationships with each other, that are going to be seeking, in a post-colonial world, seeking relationships with trading partners or whatever they need with nations that are outside the continent as well. You're not going to be able to do that under federalism. You're going to have to do it under confederalism, so that all of the sovereignty of that individual nation is maintained and protected without damaging its neighbors.
I think a big problem, thank you, Victor, is within organizing within like this like settler organizations is they believe they're their vanguards, right? That they believe they're going to be the ones leading the way for liberation, and they think they're going to be the leaders. I think, and then we have the individuals themselves that think that they're the leaders of these organizations. They become hyper individualized and hyper, which is a system of settler colonization of hyper individualism. But what people don't understand, which John Yamo has said on this podcast before, what I have talked to other, comrades, indigenous Marxists before off the podcast, is that native governments are the vanguards themselves. And I would take, like for the Navajo Nation, it's almost 300,000 people. What communist party on this continent has 300,000 people that's running an economy, that has a government, that has court system, that has all these things, infrastructure in place? Nobody does, and that's just 1 out of 574. That's not
Hey,
even
Rick, just to let you know, I think the largest one has 12,000 members.
Which one is that one?
I think it's the CPUSA.
Oh, okay.
So it's 12,000.
But that's small. But they don't.
More.
Yeah, but they don't run. They don't run run government and all this stuff.
That's
they don't
what I'm saying. That's what
yeah.
I'm saying. They have 12,000 on the entire continent. The Navajo Nation, one nation, has 300,000.
Yeah. So I think that, like I say, Yamo has said this on the first time he appeared. And I totally agree, and I think, but that's what settler needs to understand. If you really are allies, you will be promoting our sovereignty and pushing for these settler, for this indigenous governments to have more sovereignty to decolonize. It's not for your party. It's not for your comrades. It's not for your ideas about class. Yeah, we are going to deal with that. And it's a question I asked. For us is a anti-colonization stance inherently decolonial, or is a decolonial stance anti-capitalist in nature? Right. So which one is it? Right. So I think we have to understand. And I think a decolonial a movement is anti-capitalist in nature, right? It's inherently anti-capitalist. But I don't think an anti-capitalist movement is, well, I mean, like, not always, not all anti-capitalist or decolonial, because we can see Pat Sox. We're talking about it. This is the whole purpose of this thing, But I don't really think they're communists to begin with, because they don't understand how to have a proper analysis. And Yamo was next, so thank you.
Yeah, well, I think herein lies the trick, right? We have to bridge the gap between our non-native comrades. Okay, so it's like the majority of our non-native comrades are not living on are members of tribal governments living on reservations, right? They're wage slaves in the industrial core, or wherever they're at, right? So in California, for instance, it just kind of comes back to how I've chosen to organize where I'm at, right? So I'm in, I'm up here in Maidu territory, but I'm in obviously the colonial state of California, right? So no, I'm organizing with the Peace and Freedom Party, right? So the Peace and Freedom Party here in the colonial state and in the colonial election process here is the largest after 2020, right? Because of Leonard Peltier and Gloria La-Riva with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. The Peace and Freedom Party here surpassed all the other leftist parties on the ballot. It's the largest socialist party in the state now. We got about 100,000 members, right? So, in my experience with organizing with leftist parties, so-called, leftish parties prior to that, not everybody in the Peace and Freedom Party, it's people are checking off their membership, at the ballot box. Okay, so not all 100,000 of these people are mobilized comrades that are going to show up, right, or that have the full understanding of things, right? But there's 100,000 people that at least agree on anti-imperialism and socialism, right? Because Peace and Freedom Party makes it pretty clear about it's a socialist party, feminist socialist party, as it portrays itself. And then you have essentially all the leaders of the Party for Socialism and Liberation are here in San Francisco, LA, so forth, right? And that's who the candidates that win the elections or win the internal primaries are Peace and Freedom Party candidates. For instance, Leonard Peltier and Gloria La Riva, right? So these are the kind of structures that you're going to run into, and that you need to run into. You know what I mean? Not just by chance. We indigenous communists, more so than we need to make it in my opinion, we need to make it a priority to join these organizations, be in their spaces, right, and make sure that in spreading everything that we're talking about here, these are conversations need to not just be being had between indigenous communists. They need to be had between all communists or all, social, like our friend said earlier about, different tendencies or whatever, as long as we're not compromising our values here, right? Like we need to be drawing allies, people that will mobilize, right? Because these are the people that, essentially in order to get to all these concepts that we're talking about, there's going to be a physical conflict brought about by the fascist colonial state, a physical, violent conflict that we will have to win, right? And in order for us to win that, and all these things that we say that we're talking about here to even be possible to occur, we have to win that conflict. The only way we're going to win that conflict is by drawing millions of non-natives to everything that we've been talking about here. And we're not going to do that in case they've heard all these conversations, had this conversation. If they're mobilized, right? And like Mark said, that's the whole point of the party scenario, is you need to be able to mobilize, count your forces, and those, and whatever, if you want to go to Burkina Faso and Thomas Sankara, right? Your forces must be educated. They must understand why that we're engaging in when the conflict's brought onto us, because assuredly it will be the fascists that brings the conflict to us, the violence to us, as they always have and always will. The only way we'll succeed is not only by having the forces and the numbers, but having educated forces and numbers that understand why it is what we're doing. Okay. And then we have to win that conflict. And then when we win that conflict, okay, then is when we can talk about these things, or this is when we can implement these things, confederations. I always kind of, in the discussions I had with Victor, I always kind of saw it as sort of like the Communist International, sort of like a continental Communist International, indigenous international, so to speak, right? Because we have so many hundreds, thousands of nations, as we go into the South and so forth, right? So, but the first thing before any of these things we've discussed today can truly occur is this conflict that's coming. Sooner than later, it's coming because of the decay of imperialism, capitalism, colonialism. It's in decay, obviously. These trains are poisonous clouds. The earth is dying. It's being killed intentionally by these capitalists, right? And Lenin said that the education is key. Well, who do we need to have educated, right? Well, obviously the patriotic socialists are backwards oxymoronic fools because they think that we need to somehow educate the reactionary right wing, the people that want to slit our throats, right? I don't see how they're not some kind of psyop or something, especially the way they're just like driving a wedge between leftists on this continent, and in Russia, right? In the clear, Nazi propped up, the coups that have occurred in Bolivia and Ukraine, the CIA funding the OUN for 70 years, putting him in power, Stepan Bandera in Ukraine and all that, right? The patriotic socialists have made any kind of understanding that, Ukraine is a fascist shit show. They've made it so unpopular and made it so cringy to do that. You know what I'm saying? That I don't see how they're not some kind of psyop, some kind of, you know what I'm saying. But how we succeed and how we accomplish these goals and how we draw people over to us is we got to go to their spaces. They're not going to come to our spaces because, frankly, they're wage slaves and they can't afford to. You know what I mean? They're not going to drive out to our reservations, go through this whole terrible process for them of deconstructing their fake identity that the capitalists have created for them, which is a painful and agonizing identity crisis thing that they have to go through. We got to go to them. And the best place I can see to go to them, to educate them, to bring them over to our side is these kind of organizations. In California, it's the only one I can think to go to. There's very, very small groups other than that, but very, very small groups other than the Peace and Freedom Party or Party for Socialism and Liberation. And I just don't think that's the wisest place to start. You got to start with somewhere where you can get more reach. And we need to get reach, and we need to get reach fast. And we need to reach as many people as possibly as we can to understand everything that we've discussed here tonight. So that's why here in Colonial, California, it's Peace and Freedom Party for me and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Because these are the people that already understand that they're being exploited, already have the understanding of class, are already mobilized, right? Okay. So if there's a missing link that they don't have, which is the colonial contradiction, that's the place where you can disseminate that understanding as fast as possible and create potentially 100,000 comrades or whatever, potentially, right? My experience is that no full membership of any party is going to be actually mobile. You're never going to mobilize all that, but hopefully a large percentage of whatever the organization that you join is actually mobilizable, or that's whatever. You know what I mean? English is not the first language of this continent. So wherever you're at, I mean, indigenous communists out there, Africans out there that have this decolonial understanding. The African People's Socialist Party is like a great way to organize and develop your theories and to protect yourself, frankly, because that's kind of always been the case, whether it's the Crips and the Bloods and all this. It's like, African people have had to protect themselves first and foremost because of the no hesitation of fascists to just kill them. In our cases with indigenous people, at least, a lot of these racist settlers have some weird romanticism with us, right? So we have just a slight buffer there that African people straight up don't have. So, yeah, that's what I think, is that all of these ideas that we've discussed, we have to get them in the heads of our settler comrades as fast as possible so that they can do the inevitable process, because only they can deconstruct the American identity and divorce themselves from it. And they'll never be able to do that in case we've put it in their heads that it needs to be done. So that's how I suggest going about, what is actually to be done, how to do it. That's the way I've chosen to do it. And that's what I think everyone should do that's in our position. That's it for me.
Thank you, Yamo. And I'd like to say I'm in full agreement. And I think that's even in the spirit of the socialist tradition, coalition building, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. You've got like like in Algeria, like I was mentioning earlier, Algerians getting into these parties, into these French socialist parties. There's the French. There's a whole. The name escapes me right now, but like the French communists. There are all of these organizations that made up a coalition that, they'll be splintered for a time, as we have the PSL, as we have we mentioned the CPUSA. These are all people who have the most potential in this. These are the comrades that, as you're saying, Yamo, have the most potential on this continent, and they are the, we need numbers, like you're saying, we need numbers, we need people, we need heads, we need people to build this coalition with, and to ideally, as I mentioned before, dissolve when the time comes, when the National Liberation Front is formed and is mobilized. But yeah, in the interim, that I think I fully agree with you, Yamo, and that is the strategy that we need to enter these spaces and educate and let them know that this is not a socialist project as they generally. I would make that statement that generally our socialist comrades on this continent don't get this. I think that we've all been getting at that, and that's pretty much the point of this episode here, is that we broadly see that they don't get it. They don't get that this is a national liberation movement, even in the party program. Not to throw shade at CPUSA, because I have a lot of good comrades in that organization who are pushing for these very issues, and they have misgivings with the party leadership, but these are our comrades. These are the people who have the most potential, and the people that we need to organize with and bring under our coalition, under our umbrella, and educate about decolonization, and let them know that this is the movement that they need to be going for, is national liberation. We need to liberate these nations that already exist, indigenous nations, Black nation. And that's it. As far as I'm concerned, I agree, in full agreement. We need to bring these people to our side. I don't know. It looks like, unless anyone has anything else to add, I think we're over 2 hours now.
The only thing I want to say is, like, if an organization like, say, Communist Party USA wants to work with Native nations, they should reach out locally, right? But don't feel bad if a Native community tells you this certain space is not for you, right? Just saying that, right? Go reach out, say, what can we do to help out? But don't feel offended when we tell you this space on Tuesday at fucking 5 o'clock, it's not for you, because it's not. If they say it's not, it's not. I'm just putting that out there. Mylan's next.
Yeah, I was going to echo that too. Is everything we talked about here, in my mind, in my opinion, in context to Indigenous communities, coming at it from the on the ground perspective, is that Indigenous communities and nationhood and practices exists like in terms of like concentric circles. Like there's circles within circles within circles, and this conversation, I feel, is happening on an outer circle that is accessible to Stetlers and non-Indigenous people. Yeah, it's a political conversation. Yeah, it's political organizing. Yeah, we should have these conversations. But like Rick said, there's internal circles that you're not going to get access to. There's internal conversations that drive the bigger conversation, that you have to respect that autonomy in space. You have to respect Indigenous communities, and for me, like, I feel like how I want to live my life, how I want to structure my life, where I want to raise my family, will likely exist on one of those internal circles where I may not be doing as much outreach, other than maybe potentially writing. But I mean, the reality is that we're still actively keeping our community safe. Like we're like we all mentioned that, is that, there's an active role in having to protect our community and our spaces. And the political organizing, it is accessible. These are conversations you can have, you can learn, you can read, and learn what you need to learn to be able to obviously stand in solidarity with the only true revolution in the Americas, in my opinion, is going to be the Indigenous Black Revolution and Liberation Project. And again, the coalition and the Confederation model, that all sounds really, really cool. I really like that, the direction is going. One other dynamic that we have to keep in mind too, and I think we all kind of mentioned it, in particular Yamo, is that there will be conflict. Like there will be conflict, and settlers, you're going to have to stand in that and say, like, what's my morality? What's my beliefs and morals and principles in this conversation? Because we know what ours are, and we know that, capitalism and imperialism is not, like, I'm not standing in solidarity with that. And so you have to have that conversation, is that when push comes to shove, we know oppression's real. We know it's not going to stop. And in particular in our territory, like, we actively have conversations that we do know that settler colonialism as a project is going to be pushed to its limit. And you look at history, we're Gerald Horn, that conflict emerges, there's genocidal tendencies. And that echoes back into my concept of, community care. Well, it's not my concept, it's a collective concept of, keeping our community safe. Like, how do we have to organize and mobilize too to keep our community safe? And the reality for us is, like, we're fully conscious that we likely will probably just get drop-ins showing up when shit hits the fan type thing and be like, hey, we got nowhere to go. Keep in mind, that's all a part of our nationhood project. That's all a part of our governance systems, is that we don't necessarily oppress or marginalize people. We're very welcoming, diplomatic people. So, measure your landscape, look around you. What's the geopolitical context? What are the Indigenous communities? Because when push comes to shove, ideally you're there. Like, ideally you're standing in solidarity and, putting your body in between us and obviously very real colonizers and oppressors that are bringing violence into our homes and territories. So, actively think about that and critically think about that too, because the day is coming. Like, it's forecasted. It's predictable.
All right. I feel like we covered a lot. I feel like we really, honestly, I'd say we really got to the heart of a lot of this. And honored to be here with you all. And it's great hosting. It's a great honor. And on that note, thank you for listening. I think this is a good stopping point. Thank you for listening again. All right, signing off.